next for community-led housing. We've got an amazing panel, and I'm going to do some notices when we finish this, but I'm going to hand over now to Tim, who's chairing, and he will introduce our wonderful panel. Tim.
Okay, thanks everyone for coming. You should have found a handout on the chair. There's just... we kind of thought a picture tells 1,000 words, and I think it's really important to sort of see the really interesting variety of projects that we are able to hear from today. So, introduce myself. So, I work for an organisation, a community benefit society called Wessex Community Assets, and we've been involved in community housing for about 20 years. And I then got the chance to invite 4 projects that I find really inspiring. The work that we've been involved in mostly is around linking up community land trusts in rural areas to housing associations. And although it's been kind of effective in some ways in terms of the numbers, it's also been very frustrating. And so the projects that I've invited to come and share their story, I think, are trying to deal with some of those frustrations, and we'll get into that in their stories. So that's probably enough about me. So we've got Pippa from Whitleigh Community Trust, Anna from Ecomotive and Snug Homes, Athlyn from WeCanMake, and Anurag from RUSS. And so the way we're going to do it, we'll have sort of 5 minutes where each of the speakers can say something about the projects, how they've evolved, and then we'll get into some of the challenges that they faced and tried to overcome, some of the kind of inspirational, innovative work that they're doing, and then we'll also say something about, because we've got a new government, there is an opening, I think, to try and change what is a very difficult policy environment and try and shift that, what would be the recommendations. And we'll obviously open all of that out to the floor as well. So that's the plan for this afternoon. So I'm going to ask Pippa to start. I should declare an interest, which is that StirToAction has been working with Local Trust to give support to a number of local trust groups, one of which is Whitleigh Community Trust, and so I was asked to do just a few days' work with Pippa. I think I mainly just confused her, but anyway, we've been working actually for the last year. So I think I've been paid for 6 days, but we've been working together for a year. It's the kind of nature of this kind of work, because it's very slow, but I think we're getting somewhere. And Pippa is going to say something about Whitleigh.
Yeah. Thank you, Tim. And yes, we probably owe you some money. So Whitleigh, if anyone was on the thing earlier on with Matt Leach from Local Trust, so Whitleigh is one of the big locals in the southwest, one of the few in the southwest in Plymouth, and it's a post-war estate. It was the first estate built after the war, and I suspect very much that people, when they moved out there, were 6 miles away from the city centre and had to walk, and there was no infrastructure. The houses are mainly made out of something like Cornish units. I don't know if people know what a Cornish unit is in the room. So prefab concrete stuff that were not really supposed to last very long, but they're still there. And back in about 2018, on the estate, they built the largest passive house estate called Primrose Estate. And that was an interesting thing. It's still there. It's really good. It's useful to have social housing, affordable housing that is built to passive house standard. However, they didn't consult very well with the community. And so the residents really struggled. So those people who moved into those houses really struggled with how those houses worked and operated. And the cost savings to residents were not necessarily forthcoming. So it's been a really interesting project to watch from the outside. But what it did do is it sort of spurred the community on to say, if we want to have houses for the future, for social housing, then we want to be involved right at the very beginning to say how those houses should look and how those houses should act and what's really important to us. So they created their wish list, really, of what social housing should be. And we were basically offered an old piece of land that was the derelict youth centre space that was behind quite a notorious building. And the community wanted to get that land back into the community. So, and we were really lucky. We were applied to Homes England for some funding and managed to get about 50,000 for them to take the whole project up to planning permission. And we appointed Barefoot Architects, who are from Bristol, and they came down and they worked for us, and they were really good. And it's been an interesting journey. That was 2019. That's why I'm saying it's an interesting journey, because it's been a long journey. We got full planning permission in 2023, and we have been really lucky to be able to work with Ecomotive and also with Tim in about how we might move the whole project forward. And I think what's been really good over the last sort of year is about really exploring how we can get that community involvement in how we might build those houses differently and create those houses. So we've also been working with WikiHouse to see whether or not we can get the community in the build process, and that's an interesting, because that's all about procurement and how we do that. And then we've also got the other challenge about how we will manage those houses in the future. There is a very traditional route in terms of social housing that you have to become a housing association, but we are a really small community trust, grassroots community trust. Becoming a registered provider can be like a 2-year journey in itself, and actually doesn't necessarily add up for us to become an RP. So it's then, how do we then be social housing and get funding from Homes England to support us and get the funding to do it and still keep it community-led and involve training and local training in the community. So those are our challenges. It's quite exciting. We've got Plymouth University involved as well. But yeah, I'm not sure what more you want me to say about it, Tim. It's very grassroots. It's only 10 buildings, but it feels like a mountain. And if we manage it, it will be quite extraordinary to use the kind of WikiHouse stuff to do it.
So I guess, who in the audience knows what WikiHouse is? Okay, so some people don't. Could you just say very quickly what is WikiHouse? Okay,
so WikiHouse is a construction method, so a modern method of construction, where you're building cassettes mainly out of ply. They're probably about my height, so about 5 foot something, and you can build them up on top of each other. So you're creating like a wooden box, but it means that the community, and they're knocked together using sort of like wooden pegs. WeCanMake have got a very similar construction method, but they've got just slightly different, but I'll leave that. But yeah, it just means that the community can learn on site about how to build those blocks together to create homes together. And so it becomes a really real thing for participation and for learning. Our estate is probably one of the most deprived in Plymouth. So what that also means is we can really develop training skills on site. It's an estate that has a lot of people that are tradespeople. So what we can do is then build up that learning of new construction techniques for tradespeople, and also to support learners from the local community college so that they can learn some CNC skills as well. So it feels to me like it's a really sort of whole approach to building houses for communities that are completely community-led. I think the other bit that's really important to me is we had no objections. So went through all of planning, nobody on this estate, nobody from outside the estate, there was absolutely no objections to that planning process, and that's because we started right from the very beginning of that process, working with the community. Okay.
That's great, thank you. Okay, so it's a really interesting story, but it also highlights some of the challenges, and we're going to come back to that partly through the stories of the next speakers, but also in the discussion as well. So next we've got Anna Hope from Ecomotive, who I think I met about 12 years ago or something anyway, but there's a lot of us who've been involved because the journeys seem to be very long. But I think Ecomotive is one of those organisations that really has pioneered innovative ways to do things. So, Anna?
Thanks, Tim. Thanks for having me on the panel. I think I'm just going to talk a bit personally because I have quite a few different hats that I've worn over the kind of 25 probably years of involvement I've had in this whole community-led housing sector. I started out in around 2000 in Bristol, where I was in the right place at the right time to discover about and co-found the Ashley Vale self-build project in St. Werburgh's, which you might know about or have visited. It's the local community there set out to get planning permission and buy an ex-industrial site of 2 acres and facilitate construction of around 40 self-build homes, timber homes on the site, and some shared spaces and shared amenities. So I got involved in that very much with no experience at all, but we all really learned from the bottom up, and it was very experiential, and it took about 10 years to go from the original idea through to the whole thing being completed. And through that process, myself and my partner realised that there was a lot of demand for this kind of thing out there. Lots of people would come and visit and say, wow, this is amazing, do you have any plots left? And we'd kind of have to go, well, no, it's all done. But we thought maybe there's something that we can do to use the learning that we've gained from this project to help other people. So that was how Ecomotive was founded, as an independent social enterprise, looking at all sorts of different ways to facilitate community-led housing. And I think because of that kind of grassroots origin and the way that we've learned from the bottom up, and at that point there wasn't a lot of formal support in place, so we were literally kind of trying to build the sector around us, I suppose, in Bristol and also nationally, and we helped set up the National Custom and Self-Build Association. And so kind of moving on from that, I ended up being really fortunate to get funding to visit projects around the world as well. So we learned not only from visiting places in the UK, but also travelling to North America and places around Europe, Germany and Switzerland and Australia and New Zealand, and looking at the diversity of different solutions that are possible in different countries, different cultures, and where there are different types of support structures in place. And I think that's been really valuable because, as an overview, one of the things I noticed, I suppose, is there are some countries where there's actually pretty good support infrastructure for various forms of community-led housing. So in Germany, for example, there's a lot of support for this kind of idea of Baugruppen, you might have heard of it, kind of collective self-build projects. In Switzerland and Germany, there's also kind of a really good infrastructure for quite large housing co-ops. There's a lot of support from the local councils, you can get loans easily. And that's really great because you have a lot of them happening. But actually what it means is they're a lot more standardised. And actually in places where there's not a lot of support, you see, or I've observed, kind of more creativity. Because people have to be creative and innovative. And I think you'll probably hear that from all the projects here. There's not a standard path. And I think it would help if there was more of a standard path. But actually we've actually got a lot of richness in this country that I think has evolved from there being a lack of that, and the real kind of determination that you see in projects that have succeeded. So I think that kind of shows through in the type of work that we've been doing through Ecomotive, which is quite eclectic really, and we've worked with some of the more unusual types of projects, from the initial stage of ideas through to actually getting them on site in project management, development management, architecture and so on. And also we do community coaching, so working with community groups at different stages to help them get their structure in place, their decision making, their ways of relating, which is obviously really, really key, especially when people are putting in voluntary time, maybe they're putting their own money into a shared pot, there's a lot at stake. So there's so many layers to this, and it's a really rich area to work in. And that, for me personally, a couple of things. One thing that we evolved in through Ecomotive was we got into designing a timber modular home as a solution to help groups that didn't have the time to self-build physically, and that became the Snug Home, which is now formed a separate company. And for myself personally, I got into doing a PhD at the University of West of England a few years ago, but still trundling on and coming to a close soon. And what I'm looking at there is what we mean by community when we talk about community-led housing. And that has kind of travelled over the last few years from being initial kind of like, oh, I think there's something in it, through to, there's something really important in this whole thing about what do we mean by community, because what you can see quite clearly is different. Community carries so many different assumptions, but each person might have a different set of assumptions, and that can lead to all sorts of sometimes misunderstandings, sometimes synergies, but I'm just working to clarify that whole area, and it's really fascinating, and I think there's a lot in that. Sorry, I'm just going to look at my notes here. Great. So yeah, I think what I'm really interested in personally, and kind of coming back maybe to the kind of practical work, is the importance of how can we clarify what are the unique properties of community-led housing that would really make the argument for why it should be better supported. Not that it's just like a slightly niche alternative to social housing or a slightly niche alternative to private developer, but it's got there are real values in its own right which it should merit greater provision of land, finance, etc. So I think we'll probably talk about that more in the discussion, but that's kind of where I'm at the moment.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think this theme of having to be creative also applies to WeCanMake. It is a kind of difficult landscape, but actually it's really encouraging to hear sort of that you're still enthusiastic 25 years on. So Athlyn, do you want to just tell us the story of WeCanMake?
Yes, thanks. So WeCanMake is a community land trust. We're a people-led response to the housing crisis that has grown out of the community of Knoll West in the south of Bristol. Just to tell you a bit about Knoll West, so when it was conceived around 100 years ago, it was seen as the future of housing and how we could live together. A real sense of kind of radical hope was instilled in this building, and when it was built, the people who built it referred to it as the 5,000 island forest, with these kind of big semi-detached homes built in really generous gardens in a kind of sea of green space up on the hill. You can actually see it up there, just around the corner. But when you visit Knoll West today, the kind of stories that come out of it are that it's this forgotten and left behind and deprived place. Even people say it's somewhere to be kind of demolished and started over again. But a century on, and Knoll West might be the future of housing again, this time telling this new story about the creative, community-led, asset-based approach to remix how we do housing together. So WeCanMake started out of Knoll West Media Centre. If you heard Martha speaking about it earlier, it's an arts charity in Knoll West. And it started as an artist residency with Charlotte Bajeski going around with a mobile wallpaper making machine, having doorstep conversations with people around their connection to home, and they would take an item from their home, from their mantelpiece, and put it on this wallpaper machine, and while it was doing its business, kind of imprinting it, she would have conversations about how the housing crisis really manifested on the ground in Bristol. And a few months on to when the exhibition of the wallpaper was shown at Knoll West Media Centre, people asked, well, if we can create wallpaper together, why can't we create houses? And 6 years on, and we have built 2 homes. And obviously, for anyone on this panel knows, it hasn't quite been as linear as like wallpaper to homes. But I just wanted to mention that because this kind of really represents our ethos as WeCanMake, bringing art and making and joy into the complex processes involved in community-led housing. And our work always begins with this question of what if the power and tools to create good homes were in the hands of communities? So as you mentioned, we use a modern method of construction to build our homes. Very glad someone else has already described what that is. We have a community microfactory that we work out of where we literally put these tools into the hands of local people to fabricate the parts. And through this kind of creative and community-driven approach, we've seen that it's possible to build change within the existing system. So I'll just talk a bit about how the kind of model works, how we've built these 2 homes. We call it a process of gentle densification and urban acupuncture, where we unlock microsites in back gardens of existing council homes for social, low-carbon, community-led homes. One of the homes is for Tony, who was living with her parents in overcrowded situation in their council home. She had her own daughter, and it was an overcrowded situation. So Tony's parents opted into using their back garden to build a home for their daughter. Tony was really involved in this whole process in the factory, assembling these cassettes, these timber cassettes, and then when the home was constructed, she laid the floor, she sanded the floor, she painted the walls, and she kind of just did everything internally to really take ownership over this. And you really get a sense of that when you go to Tony's house today. You're really being hosted in this home that is hers and she's helped to build. Whereas the value of new housing development kind of tends to wash through neighbourhoods, we really work to make it stick by using this kind of local MMC production, so creating jobs, connecting with local forestry and using local materials and really enabling that value to stick. And it's part of how we're really motivated by how much wider social value these homes can generate. So things like jobs created or carbon saved, increases to health and well-being or reduction in loneliness. And so we measure this social value using a kind of council agreed measurement system called HACT and TOMS. And each home has generated £180,000 of social value, which works out at £3,600 per square metre. And when we look at the build costs of what we've done, it's £2,400 per square metre. And the former mayor of Bristol, Marvin Rees, said that it's kind of like getting the homes for free. So thinking about what's next, we've got these 2 homes built, we've got 2 more in planning and more in the pipeline, and the approach shows that how we can kind of rewire the system positively by putting the power and resources into people's hands. And at the same kind of rate of gentle densification that we've done in Knoll West, around kind of 3% of intensification, we know that we could build another 150 homes in that neighbourhood. And if you were to kind of scale it up and use the same model on the 1.1 million council homes built in the same period in England, that would be an intensification of 33,000 homes across the UK. Just to end by saying that like neighbourhood and local don't have to mean small or slow, and that we can be, neighbourhoods like Knoll West and all of the neighbourhoods we work in can be the kind of engines of big, bold economic futures that are regenerative, collective and care about the long view.
Wonderful, thank you. On the handout, you'll see links to the website, and there is a really good WeCanMake playbook that they were funded, I think, by the Nationwide Foundation to produce, and that gives a lot more information about the approach they've taken, so I would really recommend that. So then moving on to Anurag and RUSS, I think for me one of the interesting things about RUSS is that part of the inspiration, the early inspiration for RUSS, came from a previous generation of community housing, which is the Walter Siegel self-build movement that I think was in the 70s? 80s. The 80s, okay, it was in the 80s. So anyway, I'll let Anurag explain that a bit more, but that's a really interesting, kind of part of this long story and part of this diversity that Anna was talking about. So,
great. Thanks, Tim. My name is Anurag. I'm from RUSS. That translates to Rural Urban Synthesis Society. And our story begins somewhere around 2009 when, if you don't know, Lewisham in London has a sort of a heritage of innovative house building. And in the 80s, the architect Walter Siegel convinced the council to allow social housing tenants, people on the waiting list, to build their own homes. And he came up with this method, the Walter Siegel self-build method, and the philosophy was quite straightforward. It's a timber frame construction, but he felt that, you should be able to build a house from everything you can get from your local DIY store. So in 2009, one of the residents started retrofitting his home, installing air source heat pumps, double glazing, and the like. And his son assisted him in doing this, and his son was Kareem. And when the project finished, he sat down with John Broom, who was an architect who worked with Walter Siegel, to say, well, why can't we do more of this stuff? I mean, this is a no-brainer. And so the idea of RUSS was born as a sort of an idea of providing housing, but also having a sort of, with a very strong ecological and a very strong self-built impetus to it. And for us, it's interesting. People have talked about social rent homes and about homes for in backyards. RUSS's its foundation is this idea of what it calls a sustainable neighborhood. So, for us, a sustainable neighborhood is predominantly a neighborhood that is, financially, environmentally, and socially sustainable, but also a neighborhood that is, that actually has a diversity of ages and, incomes and abilities. So we were very clear right from the outset that we wanted to create a sustainable neighborhood. We wanted a diversity of ages and incomes. We wanted self-build to be a strong part of what we were trying to deliver. And so we then, sorry, I've lost my chain for a second. Yeah, so then we... there's one more thing I forgot. Anyway, I'll come back to it. So we set up in 2009, and it took us, we went to the council in 2014 to tell the council, look, you've got this legacy of self-built housing, why don't you help us find a site? And the council went, okay, we don't know that because there was no corporate knowledge. So we had to remind them of it. Things went cold. The trail went cold for another year till we found a site, and we approached them directly, said, look, we want to get this site. And we'll be delivering incredible social value because everything we delivered will be affordable and will be self-built, will bring skills, building skills to its community. But they asked us to submit an OJU, so we then had to go through a tendering process that cost us a lot of money. And at the end of the tendering process, we got the land. And then I think the story from there has been of trying to translate, these objectives into outcomes. So we were very clear that we wanted our homes to be affordable in perpetuity, which they are through a sort of a resale covenant. But we were also very keen that we develop a multi-tenure model where in our model we have our design for affordability is about maximizing sort of the accessibility to housing throughout the sort of age groups. So we have for sale homes, which are for the for sale homes are 1 and 2 bed homes, and they're designed for people who want to downsize probably and who have the money to buy it. And then we have very large shared ownership homes, 4 bed and 3 bed shared ownership homes, which are for young families, who need the space. And then we also have social rented homes, and we also have what we call London affordable rent homes. The other thing that we do is we promoted self-build on our scheme, and self-build is a very wide term actually, and I have to explain it. It's not about literally building everything yourself, but it's having control over the entire process. So that was what I'd forgotten to say previously. But for us, it's really important that the community designs, builds, and manages its homes. So we, as a board of trustees, have been driving this forward as clients and had to learn a lot about development management as we've gone along. Oh, sorry, 1 minute. Anyway, so the outcome is we started in 2009. We've just finished in 2014. We've got 36 homes, which are now almost all sold, thankfully, because we had a waiting list for residents. We also, just before COVID, built our own hub where a lot of our community came together to actually literally design and self-build a sort of a community space on site. And besides the 36 homes, we also have a common laundry, we have guest rooms, and we have a sort of a communal sort of planting and gardening area. But yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a fantastic project. And as I say, there's more information on the sheet that you can follow up. So you can see that for me, as somebody who's been involved a long time and just got rather frustrated, obviously this was a great opportunity to invite 4 really interesting representatives of projects that are trying to hack the system that really is difficult to navigate, but I think have achieved a great deal. So, hands up. Does anybody have an initial question? Okay, that's the first one.
Hi there. I really enjoyed that. So I work for the Architectural Heritage Fund, and we're looking to do more in affordable housing and heritage buildings, and it's a topic I did my thesis on, actually. But just wondering if you see a place for affordable housing in heritage buildings in your regions, and if you have any really good examples of those sorts of partnerships.
Okay, that's a sort of an intro to retrofit, which was something that we hoped would come up. So there are quite a number of existing community housing groups that are looking, for example, at either setting up services, to support retrofit in their area, or looking to raise funds to purchase houses and then to retrofit them and make them available as affordable housing. There's quite a number of examples of those. So, and for example, with Pippa, we're looking at these Cornish units that were these post-war prefabricated concrete houses that need a lot of retrofit work on them, and where is the potential to raise money to buy those, to upgrade them. So we're working with Plymouth University on that. But perhaps Pippa and Athlyn could say a little bit more about the work that you're doing around retrofit, because I think that's, it's an exciting area, but it's also potentially an area where community housing groups can not just focus on getting new houses built, but can actually look at the existing housing stock. And sometimes, if you look, for example, at the cooperative sector, often that was the way that housing cooperatives started, not through a new build process, but actually by purchasing existing houses, and then often, like Gyroscope in Hull, then retrofitting them and making them available as affordable houses. So, Pippa and Athlyn, do you want to say something?
Sure. I was also going to mention Gyroscope in Hull, but so we're working on a retrofit project. So obviously we build in back gardens, but also being able to look at the existing home that's there is really important. There's 5,000 homes across the estate of Norwest that are kind of in various levels of needing retrofit, both from the environmental perspective, but we're really keen on exploring what retrofit can do to the kind of well-being of the family living there. And so we have a street demonstrator project that we started within the last kind of 6 months, working with a number of families on this one street through a kind of 10-year blind approach. So we have some people who are in private rent, some who are council rent, and some private owners, and looking at what we can do collectively to make decisions on how the homes are retrofit, whether that's, as I said, the kind of environmental performance and exploring the sensing data and the technical data of how a home performs, but bringing that together with the actual lived experience of the people. And we had a really great workshop recently where we had the kind of architects and engineers come together with the families, and they would say, this is what we think you need to do in your house to do this. And you'd have the family sitting there like, well, I'm not going to do that because that's where I store my buggy, or that's where I put this. And it's bringing those two sides together is so important, because retrofit is, as much as it is about environmental performance, is about well-being and is about feeling safe and warm and healthy in your own home. And so that's kind of the level at which we're starting from. And with this project, we're seeing it as a kind of pilot and a demonstration for what else could be done on the wider estate of the 5,000 homes, and offering this up as a kind of blueprint for what can be done. And there's lots of other examples doing that around the country. So there's an organisation in Becontree Heath in Barking and Dagenham that are doing a very similar approach, and I think they have 20,000 homes. So the scale is much broader.
Sorry, there you go. I think it's probably very similar to what's happening in Knowles West is in Whitleigh. So we have a lot of the post-war houses, and I think the real issue around the health and well-being of those houses for people living in them at the moment is they're very damp. There has been previous attempts to retrofit them. I don't think it's an answer to pull down those houses, and because I just don't know how you would do that in terms of that mass move of communities. They have done that in several of the communities in Plymouth. So I think it's really important that we think about how we might retrofit spaces so that we're not just adding more stuff to landfill. In terms of the heritage stuff that you were talking about, I think I don't know the specific projects, but actually if you get onto the Centre for Alternative Technology website, there is a couple of organisations that I know who are specifically looking at heritage retrofit for social housing, and they've got a bit up there on there, so you might want to have a look at that site too. Okay.
Yes.
I just wanted to speak directly about the heritage aspect, and I'm imagining particularly you might be talking about listed buildings, which are obviously a case in their own right. I imagine there might be some that were kind of co-housing projects where a group bought a big house and divided it up. I don't know specifically, but that might be something that there was success in. I'm actually just thinking about a project I've been involved in at Bridge Farm in Bristol, where the local community bought a farm with some old farm buildings on it, a farmhouse and some barns, and with aspirations to renovate some of those into affordable housing. My impression is, and not knowing totally about the funding landscape, is that there might be a bit of a gap between, on the one hand, there is grant funding for community ownership and renovation of assets that are kind of for public use, but maybe not for housing use. So I think there might be loans, but I think there might be a bit of a gap there, because obviously the costs of renovating a listed building might be hard to sustain with just a loan. So that would be a little bit of feedback. Love to talk more.
Yeah, and I'd just add one more sort of more general thing, which is that in Dorset, we've created a partnership between Wessex Community Assets and Dorset Community Energy, and it's to research the feasibility of a retrofit service for Dorset. So the funding we've got is from the Community Energy Fund, which is not a fund that a community housing group would necessarily think about, but actually it's worth looking at. They've got lots of money, and there's potentially going to be a lot more money going into community energy, and powering down the sort of retrofit side is very important, as well as powering up. And then what we've got our eyes on, to actually set up that service are two funds. One is the MCS Foundation, which gets its money from every time a PV installation is put up or a heat pump is installed, so they've got shed loads of money. And then also Energy Redress, which is run by the Energy Savings Trust, and they've put a lot of money into retrofit services and energy advice services. So I think that there's a real potential sort of tie-in between aspirations around community housing and aspirations around community energy. So that's something just to think about. I think there's a question at the back.
Oh.
Just a question about allocations. So this is a notoriously quite difficult topic, and the initial vision on allocations might change over the course of development of the group, of the co-op, of the property. So just curious, what are your experiences with allocations and developing allocations? What are the kind of guiding maybe principles that you applied, and have you been surprised in how allocations turned out in your cases?
Yes, thank you for that question. So I guess to kind of broaden that out, there's an issue about tenure within community housing. So under the current sort of regime, if you want to get Homes England funding, you have to be a registered provider, and you either have to provide affordable rent or social rent housing. And then there are organisations like Ecomotive and RUSS that are looking at shared ownership options, and that's slightly more complicated, but I think it'd be really interesting to hear what kind of approaches the different projects are taking around tenure, and then also how that fits with this question of allocations, because I think one of the problems with government funding is that the people generally who are eligible for houses funded from government funding is that you have to be on a housing register, but you may not be eligible, or you might have been forced to move out of the area, so you're no longer on the list, but you want to move back into that area. So this whole issue around tenure and allocations is a really sort of live issue, and I think again it's another area that people are trying to sort of develop more innovative sort of ways forward, rather than a community land trust, like Whitleigh is being told, well, you've got your planning permission, now you just have to give it to a housing association. And, thank you very much for getting the project to this point, and we'll basically deal with it. So how can we find better ways, I think, to do that? So I don't know who wants to take that first.
I could talk a little bit about RUSS and the way we did our allocations. So we have just generally, as broad stroke, we have an allocations policy, and that just asks you for three things. You need to be in need of housing and not have a property anywhere else. You need to have some local connection to Lewisham, and we've been very, very loose in that local connection to Lewisham. And the third is that you need to become a member of RUSS and sort of commit to volunteering a certain number of hours a month. And in terms of our tenure mix, so this came out of co-design sessions where we worked out sort of the various sort of income brackets in Lewisham, and their median incomes, and kind of tried to work out who could afford what, and kind of came up with a tenure mix that was kind of reflective of the borough, but also in a way where the properties where you paid more, you would expect people to have the capital to pay and do an outright purchase, versus, in instances where shared ownership, where we start with as little as 25% of ownership. I think we are slightly fortunate being in London, because the grant we got was not restricted to the social rent home. So we got we got grant out of the Affordable Housing Fund, and that allowed us to sort of subsidize our construction all the way across all the 10 years, because all the homes are at 80% of market, so therefore they qualify as affordable and qualify for drawing down grant. So I imagine outside of London the scenario is different.
Yes. So perhaps put Anna on the spot, because I know that Ecomotive are working on 2 cooperative housing projects, one in Bristol and one in Wales, where you're looking at shared ownership as a sort of a way of dealing with this knotty problem. Sorry.
I'm actually completely the wrong person to ask about that, because you'd have to ask Tom or someone. I'm not working on those projects. I would just say something higher level, if that's okay, which is I think this is such a big topic, and I think a particular issue that I see is that if you're a group that's providing affordable housing, if you're providing housing on the open market prices, it doesn't really matter who you allocate to. It's kind of whoever can pay. That's kind of the established principle in this country, I guess, for better for worse. If you're offering something preferential, below market value, who gets to access it? And who gets to choose who accesses it? I think this is a really big topic that leads to a lot of misunderstandings and challenges for community groups. Because the established principle is there should be a fair allocations process that's controlled by the council or some kind of authority that manages the waiting list. If you've got a group that is in its own right providing affordable housing and they're using a different process, on the one hand, that's very legitimate for the group to do it because they're putting the voluntary effort in, they should get to choose. On the other hand, if funders giving money are kind of perhaps quite rightly saying, well, we want to choose, So I think that's just quite a big topic that we haven't got to the bottom of that yet. And I'm sure there will be some kind of more good answers, but we don't have time for that now.
Okay, and if anyone has any particular questions about this sort of shared ownership and co-ops, Tom here, put your hand up, works with Ecomotive as well, so you can grab him afterwards.
Sorry,
I'm being told that we're running out of time.
One last question here.
Is it a question about policy and what the future Labour government should be doing to support this sector? Because if it isn't...
it's not. No, funnily enough, it's roughly been answered already. I live in Sanford Housing Co-op, just down the road from RUSS, as the person who just asked a question before me, funnily enough. So I was going to ask around, a question that the panel raised earlier, which is how do you define community? We keep saying community-led housing. How do we define that? And then I was going to ask how it intersects with the cooperative housing movement, but you've kind of covered both of them already. So maybe I'll ask something about how it links in with policy and the kind of...
That was the right answer. Okay, so we're going to wrap up by our 4 speakers they've been given the opportunity to influence Labour's new housing policy. And what is your ask of the Labour government?
My ask would be don't forget about community-led housing and don't give it all to sort of housing associations, because we are really innovative in how we can do things and do things differently and do it really grassroots.
Thanks. I think that's pretty much what I would say. I could be more specific and say, consistent funding that lasts more than kind of 3 years or a year. But recognition of the value of it in its own right. I would say that it deserves its own kind of specific funding streams, planning, designations, all of that kind of stuff.
Echoing all of that, and also just saying that, the knowledge and skills to adapt and build homes and communities fit for the future are held in the hands of the communities we live in. So that's where the power and resources should be put.
Right. Everybody's answered all the questions. I think you're right. I think we need to get this community housing fund started, make it much larger. There are community exception sites in the planning framework, but I don't extend to cities, which is a problem. I think if they could do that. The only thing I would add is I'd like the government to give more money to councils. A lot more money to council. So then when we go to them and say, could you please dispose of this site to a land trust or a community-led housing group, they don't come back to us and say, well, no, I think we do need some financial consideration. We know the great work you're doing. We know it's going to be all affordable, but we don't have any money. So we do need some financial consideration. And I think if councils had more money from central government, which I hope they do now in the new government, that the councils can then, because they're quite willing. Councils are very willing to kind of help us, but their hands are also tied. So I thought maybe a bit of support for our councils.
Okay, so that's all we've got time for. I'm just going to finish by saying if there's any funders in the room, I think that sessions like this, I mean, I feel really privileged to have been able to invite 4 people, all who kind of doing it in their own time or in their work time, and there's so much knowledge that we can gain. You know, there is some really interesting things happening in this sector. There's loads of people, as we found when people put their hands up, who would like to get involved in community housing, and I think we need more spaces like this, but it needs funding, because there's no government funding at the moment. The community housing funding is gone, so we need more support for this kind of conversation and to have longer, to work together, to really influence. I think we do have this opportunity with this new government to really push things forward, but the whole sector needs support, and people who want to move into this sector need to have the support to get involved, to hear more from people who've gone through the process and can share their learning. So on that note, thank you very much to our wonderful speakers, and thank you for coming.